Hello and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today I want to talk a little bit about wetlands, and in particular I want to talk about freshwater wetlands versus saltwater wetlands. What are the differences there? I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of wetlands, what threats do wetlands face, and then what do we find in wetlands. When we talk about a wetland, we're basically talking about an area of standing water that is supporting an aquatic plant. So basically, you have these, what we think of as being terrestrial plants, but they are sitting in a shallow area. Marshes, swamps, and bogs are all wetlands. And wetlands are areas where the water table is above the top of the soil or the root layer. And so, I mean, they're no different than lakes or rivers in terms of where the surface is in relation to the water table. The difference is that wetlands are always shallow. They're always shallow, and they have an amazingly high species diversity. Lots and lots of amphibians, reptiles, fish, birds, and you have a lot of what we call the fur-bearing animals. So nutria, beavers, both that we have a long history of trapping for fur. And as a matter of fact, we have nutria in Dallas as an invasive species because of escapees from a fur farm. So there you go. But the important part is these are really rich, diverse ecosystems, and they're unique ecosystems because in some cases the wetlands are only wet part of the time. In some cases, they're wet all the time, but if you have one that dries out periodically, or if you're talking about like an intertidal zone, you've got changing conditions. You've got a situation where you're dealing with an aquatic and a terrestrial environment in some ways. So they're very unique and they're really rich in nutrients. And so there's a very high primary productivity on the scale of things like coral reefs and tropical rainforests. I mean, a huge amount of primary productivity. So your first question is, studies clearly indicate that inland wetlands have little ecological value, have no ecological services, and can be developed with no ecological consequences. Inland wetlands are vitally important and must be preserved. Inland wetlands ecological value is significantly less than the health problems that come from mosquitoes and the other parasites that are part of that wonderful rich diversity. Or inland wetlands do have ecological value, but you can use other lands to achieve the same value. So what do we think about the value of wetlands? Well, they're really unique and they're really important, and they actually provide a lot of services. On the ecological front, our ecological services are going to include things like, and I'm not going to do them in the order that I have them on the slide, but there are huge habitat for lots of plants and animals. This is a support system for many of the species that are endangered or threatened today because we have endangered and threatened wetlands around the world. And so we're actually losing species because this is the only place that they can live because it's such a unique environment. Also, it's a spawning ground. Wetlands, estuaries in particular, are little like aquatic nurseries. So lots and lots of species either spawn and live in the wetland, or they come back to mate and then raise young in the wetlands. Now, as far as their contact with other bodies of water, wetlands are really important, in particular estuaries, for buffering coastlines from storms. All these root systems and these plants help slow down water that's encroaching, and so it stops erosion and protects the land further inland from rising storm surges and things like that. And also on that same front is going to provide flood control. For the same reason, the root systems allow a lot more infiltration, and the root systems hold the soil in place. Plus, the plants themselves and that great rich soil that you find in wetlands do a wonderful job of water purification. They're very similar to the idea of filtering water through sand, gravel, and charcoal. Now, they also have economic benefits and social benefits, and we'll start with the social slash economic, and that's tourism. Lots of tourism to go, whether it's going bird watching or it's going to get away, going like camping on the edge of the wetlands, fishing, whatever. Lots of tourism and recreation. That brings in lots of money, which brings us to the economic services. The economic benefits, that water purification means that we don't always have to treat water as well when we're putting it back into the ecosystems, especially if you're talking about higher nitrates and things like that, because they'll be filtered out by the system. Also, when we're pulling water in, you don't have to always treat it as well, although you should because it's drinking water. Flood control and coastal protection, they're not just good for erosion in the ecosystem, they're great for us too because it prevents or lessens property damage from storms. Also, that nursery translates to a fishery. Lots and lots of food sources are available in wetlands, plus lots of resources are available in wetlands from the wood and plant products that you get there. Remember, we've got a high diversity, so we have a lot of different kinds of species. So when we're talking about just trees, I mean, obviously you have lumber, but plants make lots of chemicals. Lots of industrial chemicals, lots of pharmaceuticals, lots of cosmetics come directly out of wetlands and rainforests, right? And so we've got a lot of resources there. Also, the trees can be made into charcoal. This is a lesser resource, and charcoal is something we'll talk about later on because it's not particularly environmentally friendly to make it, and it uses a lot of wood. But we'll come back to that later on. But these are all things that you're getting out of these estuaries. And mangrove forests, which we'll talk about in a second, are worth globally about $1.7 billion in terms of the products that they provide. Okay, so what are the types of wetlands? We can kind of divide them into three big categories. There are your marshes, and your marshes are going to be dominated by grasses. These are your herbaceous, and by herbaceous I mean non-woody plants. So again, grasses, reeds, rushes, cattails, they're all grasses. They're extremely important not only for marine species in the terms when we're talking about like salt marshes and stuff, but migratory birds all over the world will stop at wetlands. They'll go from wetland to wetland to wetland as they migrate, and it's really, really important. They also can serve as sheltered habitats for birds to raise their young, lay their eggs and raise their young. Swamps are the next time. Swamps are going to be dominated by trees. These are going to be dominated by your woody species. So the difference between a marsh and a swamp is grasses versus trees. Okay. In swamps, sometimes they're seasonal, right? So you get sweet seasonal swamps. Sometimes they're covered year round. We have them a lot in the United States in the southeast and in the Great Lakes regions. That's where we find the majority of our swamps in Louisiana, Georgia, right, all throughout the South. And one of the big trees that dominate swamps in the United States are the cypress trees. They really occur in areas that don't drain well and where the soil surface obviously is below the water table, but a lot of that is caused by poor drainage, okay? And so you often find them in the floodplains of rivers, whereas marshes are these flat, shallow ponds or lakes. They also exist a lot on the coastline. This is actually Texas salt marsh right there, and you'll see another picture just like that in a second. All right, and then the last type of wetland, just sort of the general categories, are bogs. Bogs are different than the other wetlands in that bogs are a lot farther north. They're usually very cold. And because of the nature of the way decomposition occurs or does not occur, as the case may be, they're extremely acidic, and they're also very low oxygen levels in the water. They're usually characterized by mosses and coniferous bushes, and if there are trees, they will all be conifers, but mostly they're going to be little bushes like this guy right here. Lots of moss. This is all moss. Now, the reason I bring up bogs, they are different than the other wetlands in terms of their diversity and stuff like that. Not a lot of diversity here. Having said that, though, they are a source of peat, which is a precursor to coal, and we will talk about that when we start talking about energy. All right, so general areas swamps, marshes, bogs. Now, I do want to shift a little bit and talk about a very particular kind of estuary, or sorry, of wetland, and those are estuaries. So, what is an estuary? Where is it found? Is it found on the abyssal zone, which is the bottom of the ocean, on a continental slope where rivers and streams meet the ocean, or along rocky shores? Well, estuaries are the areas where rivers and streams flow into oceans. And here you can see a lovely one right here. You've got all these nice little streamy type things. This is what's called a delta. And anytime you hear like Nile Delta, Mississippi River Delta, you're talking about this area where fresh water is flowing into salt water, where a river meets the ocean. Here's another one. You can see all the sediment that's coming out from the river basin. Sorry, there we go. I hadn't switched the slide. I could see it, you could not. So you can see these running out, and there's all this sediment. This sediment is very rich in nutrients, so the area in the estuary, which would be all this area right here, is going to be really, really high diversity, right? High species diversity, high abundance, because of all this nutrient-rich sediment that comes from the river. Now, on the other hand, rivers carry all sorts of other things in the estuaries, and we'll talk about that later on. So essentially, what you have is this freshwater, saltwater mixing area where you've got the overlap of two ecosystems. It's this transition from land to sea and from fresh to salt water. The salinity changes throughout the ecosystem as you go from the land side to the ocean side. And river discharge varies seasonally, varies with the amount of rain. Tides come in and out, so the conditions within the estuary also change, in most cases daily. Right? And so as you have tides coming in, it's going to be a little bit saltier. If you have tides going out, it's going to be a little bit more fresh. Highly, highly influenced by the tides. Usually, though, estuaries are protected from ocean waves directly because they're kind of a little bit closed off, or they've got lots of plants. And so winds and storms are absorbed a little bit by the estuary, which we've already talked about. That's just kind of the nature of wetlands to begin with. All right, so when we look at the estuaries, so here you have the ocean, and here you have the tree line, where's all your terrestrial vegetation. This area from the highest tide to the lowest tide is going to be the intertidal zone, and this area will have a changing salinity and a changing depth of water, which means it also has a changing temperature. And so you get something a little bit like this. You have the river flowing over the ocean, and that creates a salt wedge, but there is some mixing that occurs, and so you get more fresh, more saline as you go through. And it looks something a little bit like this. So at the high tide shoreline, you may have 30% salt, whereas at the river mouth, you'll have very little salt. It's not actually zero, it's like something percent, but there is a certain amount of salt in all water because it's dissolved in there. And we talked a little bit about that in another set of video notes. Now, because of all of these changes, the organisms have to be specially adapted to these environments. And so estuaries, you'll find lots of species in estuaries that you don't find anywhere else because they can't be fully freshwater, and sometimes they can't be fully oceanic either, right? They can't be fully marine. And so you've got these very flexible, but also at the same time very limited species here. Now, because I told you there were lots of nutrients involved, high diversity, really rich ecosystems, high primary productivity, extremely fertile, right? And you can think of estuaries, just in general, as like marine nurseries. Lots and lots and lots of marine species come back to estuaries to spawn. And that, of course, sets up a huge ecosystem that is the reason for having all this diversity. Lots of plants, lots of fish, right? Lots of invertebrates, things like that. And so what you have is you have your river flowing over the land. It reaches this open area where it meets the sea. Okay. Now, there are a couple of types of estuaries that I'd like to talk about. I'd like to talk a little bit about salt marshes, not because the AP focuses on salt marshes, but because that's what we have here in Texas. They're found along most of the East Coast and most of the Gulf Coast. They're usually moderately protected areas. A lot of times there are barrier islands that will protect them, and I'm going to show you a map of the Texas coast in just a second so you can see that. The marshes will flood at high tide, and then they'll kind of drain out as the tide goes out, and they are one of the most productive environments really of all. I mean, hugely productive. Wetlands are hugely productive. The marshes can actually be divided into two parts, the low salt marshes and the high salt marshes. You don't really need to know that, but that goes to, are we fresh more or are we salt more often? And then you've got a lot of change, right? A lot of change just throughout the day. But this is the Texas coastline. You can see that almost the entire coastline is all estuarine. Right? It's all salt marshes, and it's all protected by these barrier islands, right? Here's where the Trinity runs out into the Gulf. Okay, so yay, that's our watershed, by the way. But you can see there are actually a number of them all coming here. So all of this is all going to go eventually into the Gulf. Okay, and here is a picture like the one that I showed you earlier of our salt marshes. All right, now mangrove swamps and forests are the ones that you're probably more familiar with in terms of estuaries, because these are the ones that you see on TV all the time. These are swamps, whereas remember, marshes are dominated by grasses, swamps are dominated by forests, the woody kinds of things. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like trees, they're just woody. So you can see these are all shrubs, bushes. Every plant, every woody plant that grows in a swamp is called a mangrove. And so you'll have all of these mangroves that live in these mangrove swamps. So cypress trees are mangroves, right? So typically you'll find them, the mangroves, in subtropical and tropical areas. They are dominated by mangrove trees, and mangrove trees have very special roots. I'm going to show you some pictures in just a second. The distribution of the trees is controlled mostly by temperature. Oh, I mentioned temperature earlier. When you're talking about estuaries and these areas like this, temperature changes with depth. The deeper the water is, the cooler it is. The shallower the water is, the warmer it is. And so if you have changing depths in addition to, changing salinities, you will also have changing temperatures. Okay, so back to this. Same thing, it's just another estuary. The mangroves themselves, when they die and they all of this plant material starts to decompose, that's a big source of nutrition for the area. So if it's not an estuarine mangrove swamp, right? Some are, some are not. Some are fresh, some are saltier, some are estuarine, which is the adjective for estuaries. But there's a lot of plant matter that makes that nutrient level even higher. You don't need to know this in terms of memorizing all this stuff. I don't like it when you memorize stuff to begin with. But basically, these are the 5 types of mangrove forests. I took this from a really great source. It's in your PowerPoint. You can click here. It's basically ocean.com, or it's not .com, but it's a site all about oceans. So go there. Very exciting. Yeah, so these are just the different kinds, and you can see how the trees change in relation to where the water is and stuff like that. I just wanted to show you that there's a lot of variety. So when you see these pictures, you can see why there's a lot of variety, because it depends on the geography, it depends on the bodies of water as to what these will look like. But what they all have in common are these cool branching roots, right? Remember that all of these wetlands have fairly low oxygen in the water, and so the roots come up so they can get more oxygen. You can see here some knees, like cypress knees. Here are just some branches that skip along. And you can see these are actually totally different environments, but they all have the same kinds of adaptations to that low oxygen level. The other thing that you see is this is a leaf, and these are salt crystals. Most of these mangrove swamps will have to deal with those changing salinities, but at the very least, they're going to have to change with higher salinities than just regular freshwater. And so they all have adaptations to eliminate the salt, usually through their leaves. And you, like I said, you can see these beautiful crystals. This is a natural process. The tree is actually just forcing that extra salt out. So where are mangroves found? They are found in coastal regions, subtropical to tropical, like I said earlier, and you can see that lots of diversity. Now, not all mangrove swamps have really high diversity in terms of the mangrove species themselves, but they may support lots of fauna, lots of different kinds of fauna. So even though you may have one or two anchor species, you will have all of these other species that are built on that chain. Okay, sorry about that. That was pretty exciting. Got a little thing there. Okay. All right, so here's your next question. It is illegal in some states to cut down a mangrove tree. That's true. Actually, Florida recently made it illegal. But mangroves are really important to the health of estuaries and to the health of the surrounding ecosystems. And so we have started to protect them more because there are a lot of threats to them, and we've started to realize the amazing amount of services they provide. So what are the threats to mangrove forests and to estuaries? The big threat is really coastal development. We tear them up. We like to live at the coast. We like to live in areas that we consider beautiful. We like to live near recreation areas, and so we really do just destroy them. The other thing that's a problem is once we start developing, we get a lot of erosion. And so erosion just in general will start to break down those ecosystems. The other thing is we do a lot of shrimp farming, not necessarily in the United States, but in other places, and we use those estuary ecosystems for the shrimp farms. We will talk about aquaculture a little bit later on in this unit, and so I'm going to come back to that later on. Rising sea levels pushes more salt water into the estuaries, and you get less fresh water, and so that changes what's going on there, and sometimes that exceeds the species limits of tolerance. And you have invasive species. Wherever we go, we take things with us, and so we get things that we intentionally release, like kudzu. We get things that we unintentionally release, like rats. And so lots of mangrove forests and estuaries are having invasive species problems, like most ecosystems out there. And we'll talk about that in another unit as well. Okay, so one of the things we're going to want to figure out is, what do you do about all this stuff? And so that's what we'll talk about in class. And if you have any questions, please make sure that you've written them down and that you ask them in class, and I will see you next time.